We are at the end of this study. This should be the last part, the last chapter, before we go on to something else, starting after Easter. But we stopped last time in the middle of the list of governors. We looked at Felix and Festus, both of whom Paul had communication with. Paul was a prisoner during their governorships. Felix left Paul in prison to do a favor to the Jews. Festus brought in Agrippa II as well to listen to Paul. And Festus died suddenly at the end of his time in office. He wasn't removed the way that most of them were. He actually died, and so there was a gap between the end of his time in office and somebody else coming to replace him. There was a brief time when there was no governor. And the high priest at this time, who was Annas, the son of Annas, so Annas II, he took advantage of this fact to pretty much do what he wanted. This is from Josephus, the Jewish Antiquities. Festus was now dead, and Albinus, who was going to be the next governor, was still upon the road. So Annas, the son of Annas, assembled the Sanhedrin, and he brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some of his companions. So this is the guy who wrote the epistle of James. Not James, the son of Zebedee, who was already killed by Agrippa I. But when he, Annas, had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But the most equitable of the citizens were uneasy at this breach of Roman law. He did not have the authority technically to do this. And then they sent to Agrippa, to Agrippa II, who was king not of Judea, but king in the north. And he had been given authority to appoint or get rid of high priests. And the Jews were much more willing to allow him to have that authority than a Roman governor. So he was the one that the Jews appealed to. They asked him to command Annas to act so no more, for what he had already done was not to be justified. Some of them also went to meet Albinus, the new governor, as he was on his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Annas to assemble the Sanhedrin without his consent. Albinus agreed with what they said, and he wrote in anger to Annas, threatening to punish him for what he had done. And because of this, King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him when he had ruled only 3 months. So, during that time of freedom for the high priest, which he abused, James and some of the other Christians in Jerusalem were killed. But Albinus got there. Lucius Albinus was the next governor. And, of course, with these last few governors, we have to remember that Josephus, who is our main source for what these men were like, he was part of the war that came about. He fought for the Jews in the revolt that resulted because of what these guys did. So he's going to paint them in a very negative light. He's going to not say that the Romans themselves were bad because he's writing for a Roman audience, but he's going to put a lot of blame on these men for what happened. So a lot of what he says most likely is true, but whether he's leaving out things that might make these men seem a little bit less bad than they were, it's hard to say. But Albinus, the way that Josephus paints him, was extremely corrupt and routinely accepted bribes even from the worst criminals. He would arrest people. He would arrest rebels and assassins, sicarii, but he would let them go again if they could pay him enough. So criminals were allowed to wander free. All he cared about was the wealth that he made for himself. And according to Josephus, during Albinus's rule, nobody dared to speak their minds, but tyranny was generally tolerated, and at this time the seeds were sown which brought Jerusalem to destruction. Josephus also says that Albinus appears a most excellent person when you compare him to the governor who came next, Gessius Florus. And Florus was a special kind of bad. Florus, in order to gain plunder for himself, as well as to cover up his many lesser crimes, actively abused and insulted the Jews until they started to riot, which would give him an excuse to seize their property. That was his method. He would try to antagonize them, try to make them as angry as possible so that he could plunder them in response. And he overdid things. He knew that things were going badly, and he didn't care. He was becoming rich by doing things the way he was. Despite the best efforts of Agrippa II and the older generation, there were a lot of people who didn't want war. Agrippa II tried his very best. He tried to convince people that going to war with Rome wouldn't work. They were not going to succeed. That on the whole, Rome hadn't really been that bad to them. But he had to admit to those who challenged him, submitting to Rome at that time would mean submitting to Florus, and that is something that they were not willing to do. And full-scale war did break out in AD 66. And so the trouble really began in Caesarea when a Greek killed some birds and left them on an earthen pot on the steps of the local synagogue. And that might seem like some just bad vandalism. This was actually seriously offensive. It was a common slur among the Gentiles to call the Jews a leprous people. The story they told was that it was because the Jews were so susceptible to the disease of leprosy that the Egyptians drove them out back then. And they looked down on the Jews as a nasty people because of that. And killing a clean bird over an earthenware pot was part of the Levitical ritual for cleansing somebody who had leprosy. Okay, so this was really a very strong racial slur, as well as desecrating a synagogue. And the Jews asked Florus to deal with it. This isn't something that the Greeks in Caesarea were allowed to do, to antagonize the Jews in this way, to vandalize. And Florus accepted the bribe that they offered him to deal with it, because you had to offer Florus a bribe before he would do anything. But he didn't, in this case, do anything to punish those responsible. In fact, he antagonized the Jews further by robbing the temple of about 17 talents. And he did this quickly before people really knew what was going on or could organize any resistance. But some of the Jews began mocking him for this. They began taking up a collection for poor Governor Florus because he was clearly so impoverished that he needed to take money from the temple. And Florus became incredibly angry because of that, demanded justice against those. The Jewish leaders said there's no way to really know who did this. And are we going to punish a whole lot of people for the sins of a few? It's impossible to track them down. He didn't accept that. He killed a lot of innocent people. Things just sort of spiraled out of control from there. And even after everything Florus had done, many of the Jews still wanted peace with Rome. And the Jewish rebellion really began as a civil war between the rebels and the conservatives, the zealots that wanted to fight Rome and the people who just wanted peace, who realized what a terrible thing a war with Rome would bring. And the rebels won that fight. They were able to take control of Jerusalem. And what really started the war for real, how they declared their independence, was they put an end to the daily sacrifice that was offered for Caesar. So every day in the temple there was a sacrifice made specifically for Caesar, not to Caesar, but for him. And stopping that sacrifice was saying Caesar is no longer our ruler. We no longer recognize him as our king. So Annas, the son of Annas, tried to take the temple back from the rebels, but an army came from Idumea to help the rebels, killing Annas and his supporters along with several civilians. So a lot of people in Jerusalem were killed by each other, not even by Rome. And after much bloodshed, the Zealots gained control not only of Jerusalem, but of all Judea, and expelled the Roman forces. The Romans weren't really prepared for this kind of uprising, this kind of strength so suddenly. And they were able to take over for a very brief time, had freedom, started appointing leaders, organizing an army because they knew that Rome was going to come. They knew that Rome was going to retaliate. But it felt for a while like the Maccabean revolt all over again. It felt like they were winning against this big, terrible enemy. But there were some very important differences between this and the Maccabean revolt. First of all, Judaism wasn't really being threatened. It was being insulted. It wasn't being respected, but it wasn't being threatened the way it was under Antiochus Epiphanes. Not by a long shot. And the Zealots' motives were less religious. They were less about defending the faith. They were more about political freedom from Rome. And their methods were also very dishonest and cruel. For instance, when the Roman garrison at Jerusalem surrendered on the condition that their lives would be spared, as they were leaving the city, they were all slaughtered, except for one man who promised to convert to Judaism if they spared his life. So they betrayed and murdered the entire Roman garrison that was there. And that happened on a Sabbath, by the way. The Maccabean revolters who rebelled against the Seleucids were reluctant even to defend themselves on the Sabbath, much less commit murder. So a very different kind of war, a very different kind of attitude behind it. But the next year, the Romans did retaliate. They sent General Vespasian, who invaded Galilee. This is Vespasian here in the picture. He invaded Galilee on a campaign to put down the rebellion. And he and his son Titus conquered the divided Galileans first. They came down from the north. And they captured their military governor, a guy named Josephus. Okay? So Josephus is a part of the story he tells. And that's a picture of Josephus right there. But Vespasian defeated Josephus and his forces at the town of Yodfat. At the end of the siege, When they took the city, Josephus was trapped underground with 40 other men. And when Josephus tried to surrender to the Romans, the Jews with him threatened to kill him. Josephus proposed that if they were all going to die anyway, they should randomly determine the order in which to kill each other, with the last man alive committing suicide. And probably using math, Josephus ended up the last one alive and went out and surrendered to Vespasian. So he was not accepted by his people after that, not seen in a good light at all, very much as a traitor. Especially since, just to the extent Josephus sided with Vespasian. According to Josephus, Vespasian decided to keep him alive as a slave because he made a prophecy that Vespasian would become emperor. And in fact, Josephus eventually became convinced that Vespasian would be the one to fulfill the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament, that he was the one who was going to bring peace to Judea and to the world, not in the way that the Jews imagined it, but basically that Vespasian was the Messiah. But that prophecy that Vespasian would become emperor, whether that prophecy was, it's hard to tell. We only have Josephus's own account. But that is what ended up happening. In AD 68, Nero, the last Caesar, was declared an enemy of the state by the Senate and committed suicide at the age of 30. So at only 30 years old, Nero died, and he didn't have an heir. So a power struggle erupted after his death, resulting in what was later called the Year of the Four Emperors. They just came one after another. And the rebels in Judea took this as an encouraging sign that the Roman Empire would soon collapse and be replaced by the Messianic kingdom. It suddenly didn't seem far-fetched to them anymore that they were going to not only win in their own country, but they would be able to take over and replace the current world empire with an empire of their own. So finally, Vespasian's supporters declared him to be emperor, and so he returned to Rome, leaving his son Titus in command. And Josephus stayed with Titus as his interpreter and as an eyewitness to the events that followed. And Josephus was later brought to Rome, where he was set free and became an honored Roman citizen. And he even took the name Flavius Josephus. Flavius was the family name of Vespasian and Titus. So he was adopted into their family, which explains he had an income, he had time to write, and he had the means with which to publish and promote his works. But despite the war that was going on, thousands of Jews traveled to Jerusalem that year for the Passover. And when Titus besieged the city, they were all trapped inside. There were far more people there than were supposed to be, than normally would have been. And on top of that, to give people motivation to fight rather than negotiate, the Zealots burned much of the city's food supply. They didn't want a long siege. They destroyed the food to try to force people to fight. But the siege ended up lasting 7 months. As you can imagine, a huge number of people starved to death. Everyone who tried to escape was crucified outside the city walls until the Romans ran out of wood for crosses. It got that bad. When the Romans finally entered Jerusalem, Thousands more were killed, and almost the entire city, including the temple, was destroyed by fire. But remembering Jesus' prediction of the city's destruction, and in response to a vision, the Christians in Jerusalem all fled before the siege began. And because of this, and because they weren't interested in helping to fight against the Romans, the Jewish Christians were seen as traitors by their people. And because of the enmity that they showed to Christians, the Gentiles also began to view Christianity as a new religion, separate from Judaism, rather than a sect of Judaism. In Luke chapter 11, verses 47 through 51, Jesus tells the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, "Woe to you, for you build the tombs of the prophets, but your fathers killed them. So you are witnesses and approve the deeds of your fathers, because it was they who killed them, and you build their tombs." Which doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense on the face of it. If they're honoring the prophets that their fathers killed, but it's a hypocritical thing because they continue to do the same thing. They continue to oppose the work that God is doing, the prophets that God is sending, in the same way that their fathers did. And yet they honor those who have died in the past. Very similar to the different ways people felt about Martin Luther King Jr. before his death versus after his death. The opposition he faced and then becoming a hero afterwards. That's their attitude, that kind of hypocrisy toward the prophets. And for this reason, Jesus says, also, the wisdom of God said, "I will send to them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill, and some they will persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation. From the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the house of God." That was King Joash had Zechariah killed, the son of the man who had raised him, Jehoiada the priest, when Zechariah condemned him for turning to idols. "Yes, I tell you, it shall be charged against this generation, the blood of all the prophets." And it was that generation that went through this, that was destroyed in 70 AD. 3 years after the siege of Jerusalem, the last rebel stronghold, really the end of the revolt, happened here at Masada, the fortress that Herod the Great had built up, where he had hidden refugees before. It was one of the strongest strongholds in Israel. The Sicarii had taken it over, and the Romans were able to build a ramp up the side of the mountain, reach the top. According to Josephus, 960 Jewish rebels who were up there killed each other to avoid capture. But even that wasn't the end. That was the end of that rebellion. But though the Great Revolt had been crushed, the Jewish hope for independence lived on for another 60 years. And in AD 131, so about 36 years after the New Testament was completed, a Jew named Simon Bar Kokhba led his people in another war against Rome. And this was the last revolt. Many people believed that he was the promised Messiah, or at least after his defeat, that he had been a failed Messiah. What he believed about himself is very hard to say. We don't have a lot of information. But after 3 years of fighting, he was defeated. And at that time, the Romans banished the Jews from Jerusalem. They weren't allowed even inside of it. And they reorganized Judea, Samaria, and Galilee into a single province called Syria Palestina. And that was the end, as far as they were concerned, of the Jewish nation. But if you saw in that picture of Simon Bar Kokhba, above his head there was a star shooting across the sky. And that's because of Numbers 24:17. A verse that a lot of people associated with him. Numbers 24:17. Something Balaam said. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob. A scepter shall rise from Israel, and shall crush through the forehead of Moab, and tear down all the sons of Sheth. Bar Kokhba was a failed Messiah. All those who came before him, except for one, was a failed Messiah. But this hope is not a vain hope. They just looked for it in the wrong person. They looked for it in the wrong kind of movement. The nonviolent movement started by Christ and carried on by his apostles to bring peace between humanity and God is the movement that lived on. And it's the movement we're part of today. So, any questions about anything we went over today? Yeah.
Or makes of thousands of days for slavery father, someone like Simon.
In what time? Sorry. Probably, probably both. I would imagine. Yeah. Yeah, it's not something I looked into specifically, but it was pretty common practice with prisoners, especially at the end of a fight like that. Anything else? Let's go ahead and close in prayer. Father, thank you for the fact that you have preserved a record, not as reliable as your word, but let us know what happened, how the words of Christ were actually fulfilled, not to the extent that they one day will be, but that your word can be trusted, that those who tried to go their own way and not submit to your will have never prospered in doing so, truly not in the long run. And please help us to remember that, to recognize your will for our lives, to not try to fight our battles in our own strength, but to rely on your power, and to make sure that it's the right battles that we're fighting, the battles you care about, that our relationship with you would be our highest priority. And that others would come to know you through our lives and through our witness. In Jesus' name, amen.